Well, good evening, City Life Church. It's really good to be with you this evening. And I'd like to just start by saying thank you to your Pastor Daniel for inviting me and giving me the privilege to speak to you this evening. Now, I understand that you've been thinking about times and seasons. And I love the different seasons here in the UK because seasons are about the process of change. And we live through different spiritual seasons too, and Jesus wants us to understand the season that we're in, the signs of the times. He rebuked the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Matthew 16:3 for being unable to recognize the signs and to interpret. He said, you can understand the weather systems, but you can't interpret the signs of the times. And back in February, we were experiencing very stormy weather, if you cast your mind back to that period. And all the storms were given names. We had Lorenzo, we had Brendan, we had Kira, we had Dennis, and we had George. And every week, I remember on a Sunday being literally blown into our meeting venue by a different storm. And storms are very biblical, aren't they? We read about storms a lot. And Jonah was in a storm and he was thrown overboard. And then we read about the Apostle Paul who was shipwrecked. And in Luke chapter 8, we have another storm where the disciples are in a boat with Jesus when suddenly a storm comes. And they began to panic and they woke Jesus up and said, Master, Master, we're going to drown. And Jesus got up and he rebuked the wind and the raging waters, and the storm subsided and all was calm. But then he turned to the disciples and he said, where is your faith? And I've got 3 words for us to be thinking about tonight. And the first word is where. In the storm, in the wilderness, God finds out what's in our heart. Now, we can live through all 4 seasons in a week, even in a day in the UK with the vagaries of the British weather. And as a church, we often have a Fed Up with February event. So back in February, I said to the church that this year, because we don't have our own building, that we wouldn't be having an event, but I was sick and tired of the various storms that we were going through. And that we were in that awful period of in-between. We were between what had gone, the winter, the past, and what was to come, the spring, the future. But we have to live in the season that we're in, don't we? And it's in the in-between times that we can become impatient. Now, little did we know then that there was going to be a far worse storm to come. And this storm was not just going to hit our country, but indeed the whole world. And it too had a name that we're all now very familiar with. It was the coronavirus storm, or COVID-19. Of course, it has nothing to do with the weather, but it's a storm nevertheless. And we can see and feel the effects, can't we, of a stormy day. We can see the wind blowing in the trees, we can see the rain if it's lashing down, but we couldn't see this storm, and it was weird because its danger was hidden from us. But we could see its effect because we were told nightly on the news the effect that it was having, sadly, on so many of our population. And here we were in this storm, being told to stay indoors when outwardly all seemed right with the world. Just when the season had changed to the hottest spring on record, we now know, with hours and hours of glorious sunshine, we had lockdown, stay in your home. Now in Luke chapter 8, Jesus wasn't just in the storm, he was in the boat with his disciples when he asked that question, where is your faith? And he's in the home with us too during the coronavirus storm. And in John 14:23, we read this, Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching, and my Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. And perhaps Jesus tonight is just asking the same question of us. Don't panic. You're not going to drown. Where's your faith? Back in September 2019, I said to our church, the future ain't what it used to be. In other words, I felt that a time of change was coming, a season of change. And these times are currently being called, aren't they, unprecedented times. Now, the following month, in October, I met your Pastor Daniel for the first time. And it was at the filling station in Bosham where Daniel was to be the speaker that night. And Daniel was speaking on the subject of the future church. What does it look like? And he said that the church of the future doesn't look like the church of the past. It doesn't even think like the church of the past. And he asked the question of us, are we willing to let things go? Now, my husband and I looked at each other because we were finding that Daniel's thoughts were resonating with our thoughts. Then, in February this year, I woke on what happened to be a palindromic date, the same backwards as forwards. It was 02/02/2020. And I felt strongly that God was reminding me we're not going to be living the future forwards, the same as the past, backwards. And as a church, we were looking forward to a brand new season emerging because we'd almost completed a building project. We had this amazing new facility and we were eager to use it. And we were on the cusp of doing so. And we had felt that God had said to us that once we were in this lovely brand new facility, that it would be for us a time of harvest. So where was our faith in COVID-19? Did we still believe that? I just want us now to think about the story of Joshua tonight and tie in these thoughts. So my second word is why. In Joshua chapter 1, we have God making the stark pronouncement to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now the future, you have to say, looked pretty grim at this point. The past was about their great leader Moses, but the future was going to be about Joshua. And God says, you and all these people are to get ready because you are about to cross the Jordan into the land that I'm about to give to you. Suddenly the future's looking up. But he's told 4 times you will need to be strong and courageous. And then he's given very specific instructions of what to do, which is to follow the Ark of the Covenant into the river. Now let's just go back a little bit. After the people had built the golden calf in sin and disobedience, Moses had gone up the mountain to God and pleaded with him on their behalf, God, if your presence doesn't go with us, don't send us up from here, because how will people distinguish us if you're not with us? And God relents and says, I will go with you because of Moses pleading on their behalf. So Moses begging God for his presence in the past certainly was going to affect the future and the next generation with Joshua. And God promised Joshua, just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. So here we have Joshua. He's told he's got to follow the ark, which is effectively following the presence of God into the river. But why? That's the next word. Why? Because just like us in our situation now, God said, because you've never been this way before. This too was an unprecedented time for the people of God. And God threw in a bit of social distancing too, for good measure, because we read keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits. Now, that's just over 914 metres, so a bit more than our 2 metres, but they had to keep a distance of 2,000 cubits between them and the ark, them and the presence of God, because they were to have respect and revere the presence of God. Now, if you're going to cross a river, you definitely don't want to do it at flood stage, yet this is the precise stage that God chose for the people to cross the river. It's treacherous. We were on holiday last year in Yorkshire and we saw plenty of rivers at flood stage because another storm came during that period, and it makes staying at home in lockdown a doddle compared to what these people had to do at this time. And so we read in chapter 3 verses 14 and 16 that when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the Ark stepped into the river, as soon as their feet touched the water's edge, the water upstream piled up into a heap a great distance away. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. And years ago, when God began to show me this word, he put it in my heart that I was to speak it out, but not only to speak it out, but to live it out. And I was to be strong and courageous, just like Joshua. And so about 10 years ago, as a church, we had an all-night prayer meeting, and I had this long piece of material which was to represent the river of God. And we metaphorically stepped into the river to say to God, we are choosing to step into the river, Lord, to cross over into this promised land. We want to be obedient to the word you've put into our mouth and put into our hearts. And we are going to step into this river for you to bring us into all that you have for us. And please, Lord, will you fulfill your promise and bring us the harvest. So here we were on the cusp of all these promises being fulfilled. City Life Church, you were on the cusp of a conference that you were about to have, a conference where you were full of expectation for breakthrough for the city of Portsmouth. We also had Franklin Graham, despite all the opposition that he was up against, about to embark on a tour of the UK when wham, COVID-19, this storm hit us. Now, I expect many of you remember the 1987 hurricane and Michael Fish saying that there was no storm coming. And then we woke up the following morning to the absolute devastation of what the hurricane had left behind. And there were trees down, there were windows smashed, people had their roof blown off their houses. And here we had, with this storm of COVID-19, similarly, the devastation of everything that we did suddenly dismantled overnight. And everything that we took for granted suddenly having to change. And here we were in the midst of this storm, asking the question, why, Lord? Just when we were expecting great things, just when we felt we were on the cusp of breakthrough, why? Now, the answer may lie within my last word, which is what? Last Sunday was Pentecost Sunday, the birth of the church, the coming of the Holy Spirit. And on the Thursday before Pentecost Sunday, my husband Paul took part in a Zoom meeting which was taking place in Jerusalem. And people, just like the day of Pentecost, from all over the world were gathering. And a Messianic rabbi there was hosting the meeting. And the rabbi shared some things that I now want to share with you. We know the story of the Tower of Babel, and I just want to read it to you from the Message. It says, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth.' God took one look and said, 'One people, one language.' Why, this is only a first step. No telling what they'll come up with next. They'll stop at nothing. Come, we'll go down and garble their speech so they won't understand each other." Then God scattered them from all over the world, and they had to quit building the city. That's how it came to be called Babel, because there God turned their language into Babel. From there, God scattered them all over the world. So at Babel, God confused the language to stop them thinking that they were in control. But at Pentecost, where God-fearing Jews from every nation were gathered, suddenly God unmuddled the language to bring clarity again, so that everyone could understand and hear them proclaiming the wonders of God in their own tongue. And this time that we're living through now is nothing like we expected as on the day of Pentecost. And the world and the church are asking my third word, which is what? What does this mean? What does this mean? And perhaps one answer may be that, like the people who built the Tower of Babel, the world has thought it's in control. It doesn't need God. It can handle this. It can go it alone. And perhaps too, even we, as Christians, as the church, can think like that in subtle ways that can deceive us. We too can be wanting to make a name for ourselves, to build our ministries, to build our churches. And the bigger the platform gets, the bigger the kudos, the bigger our egos and reputations can grow. And then suddenly coronavirus comes along, and all that we usually do is dismantled, and we suddenly have to find new and more simplified ways not to go to church because we can't anymore, but to be, as was always intended, to be church. To be church involving everyone, because everyone on the day of Pentecost was filled with the Spirit, and everyone heard them praising God. And suddenly we've seen a return of kindness, of generosity in our world, of looking out for others, of being suddenly really concerned for our neighbours, for our street, for our communities. And of course we've always been that, but suddenly there's been a real resurgence in it. We've had more people looking for online church during the virus. Online Alpha has had 1,600 applications since lockdown began. The UK Blessing went viral. Boris Johnson gave it a Points of Light award for people who've had a positive effect on the country. And then back in March, we had the day of prayer called by the Archbishop. We were encouraged as we prayed to light candles, to put them in our windows, to depict that Jesus is the light of the world. And in times of chaos, we need light. Right at the beginning of God's story, God brought order out of chaos. We read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light." And we're praying again for the Spirit of God to move over the darkness, to pray for God to bring clarity, to pray for God to bring order out of the chaos, and for the whole nation, the whole world, to hear again the people of God declaring and displaying the wonders of God. So in finishing, just as at Pentecost was the birth of the church, and they asked the question, what does this mean? Perhaps this season, this time that we're living in, we can sense that the answer might be the rebirth of the church, a reawakening. God has said to us so many times, hasn't he? Wake up, church, wake up. And perhaps too it's a season of renewal, a change, a time of resurgence for God's church. And perhaps we too will be able to let some things go for the something new in this new season to emerge. And I pray that right now that we will find authentic faith, knowing that God is in the storm with us. And if we're asking why God, I pray that we'll know his presence and the words he's put in our hearts, that we will be able to speak them out and live them out as we've never been this way before. And when we ask the question, what does this mean, Lord? I'm praying that God will bring clarity to us, that he will be a light to us in the darkness. And may we all be aware that as we're travelling on this unprecedented journey, may we really have a sense tonight of God's presence with us. Because if he's not with us, don't send us up from here, Lord. But may we have a real sense that God has promised his presence, that he's on the journey with us. If I was going through a difficult season in my life, my mum always used to say to me, Mary, this too will pass. And I'm confident that this too will pass. And we will emerge from this. But meanwhile, I pray tonight that we will all of us hold on to God. Amen.